All right, now let's talk about our financial planning topic. So I'm going to switch to my whiteboard here, and you're going to see me looking down because I'm going to draw on here. So let me just move my stuff out of the way and get ready for this. I'm starting to like the new YouTube format. I'll just say I did notice some big differences with Zoom last week when we talked when we had our webinar with David McKnight. But I'd love to hear feedback of what you think about the new format, the studio, etc. The studio is really kind of nice and cozy in here. Once I get in here, I have something on the door that says "Don't come in," but it's kind of nice just to be in here, and I hope it all sounds good and looks good. All right, so today we're going to talk about the national debt and your retirement plan, as we discussed. Now, just last week we talked about the U.S. Treasury Report and the Congressional Budget Report, but we focused on really Social Security and Medicare and some of those other topics that were affected by those or brought out in those reports, and of course, tax revenues and expenditures. But there was so much in those two reports that I said, okay, we're going to continue this discussion next week. But we're going to talk about the national debt. And in fact, I just added on here. So you would remember we went through all this last week, the future of Social Security, and how it related to the these reports, and we talked about the unsustainable fiscal path, and we're going to continue on with that. But there were some things that again we're going to touch on today, but we're going to focus on the national debt. And David and I talked a bit about this last week. So let's go through it. So first thing I want to share with you, I'm going to drag this down, is the U.S. national debt clock. So if you go to usdebtclock.org, you'll see this. I don't know why that's sticking up there, but over here on the left here, if you see my cursor or my pointer, that's the current national debt, 31.5, almost $31.6 trillion. And this is really flying. You'll see these numbers. This is shocking, right? So when I put this number up for my class, you really can't take a snapshot of what the national debt is. Oh, I'm sorry. And for those of you just joining us on YouTube, please hit the like, subscribe, notification button. So we segment this out. I think you know. So we do the full weekly webinar, which is 45 to 50 minutes, sometimes an hour, depending on the topic. And then we do a section called the Financial 15. And the Financial 15, so you might see the same topic, but two different thumbnails on our YouTube page. But the Financial 15 is just the financial planning topic. So many of you are coming on just for the financial planning topic in the Financial 15. And it's not always 15. It's often a little bit more than the 15. So bear with us. But if that's you, if you're just listening to this, or just joining us, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification button. And if you are listening, what I'm showing is if you go to usdebtclock.org, you can follow along, and the national debt might be much, much higher than it is right now at 31.6 trillion. It just turned for us. Did you guys all see that? It just turned to $31.6 trillion. That's nothing to celebrate. And we just witnessed it, right? So $31.6 trillion solidly now and climbing, and you can track that at usdebtclock.org. And that's the U.S. national debt that we owe on the bonds that we issue. And we have to pay interest on those bonds. And we have to borrow for things now we didn't have to borrow for just a few years ago. The class I teach used to say that 96% of all tax dollars go to fund just four things: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the national debt. And now it's 101%. 101%, which means that we are borrowing to pay for those things. And that leaves no extra money for any other program. You pick it. There's a lot of federal programs out there. National parks. I love the national parks. We went to, my family and I went to Grand Canyon, the Grand Canyon last year. Great, beautiful park if you've ever been there. But that's one thing that's not being funded by tax dollars. It's funded by debt. Congress, the Senate, the White House, the IRS, the armed forces, all of the armed forces, there's just not enough there. So you pick it, any other program other than the ones we talked about. So we're going to dig into that a little bit more. There's a lot of material here. So let me move that back. All right. So you should be seeing my screen again. So that's the debtclock.org. We talked about that. So there are two government reports that recently came out in February. I talked about this last week that continue to sound the warning. And the one was the Financial Report of the United States from the U.S. Treasury Office. The second was the Budget and Economic Outlook 2022 to 2020 or 2023 to 2033. And that's from the Congressional Budget Office. So they both came out within, I think, about a week of each other, but maybe a few days. The Congressional Budget Office, I shared this with you last week, but I'll read it to you again, or you can join me in reading it. They said we have an unsustainable fiscal path. Not the first time that they've said this in their report. An important purpose of I'm going to read this section to you just to kind of tee up this discussion. So this is from the CBO report, and we're going to talk about the U.S. Treasury Report in a second. An important purpose of this financial report is to help citizens understand current fiscal policy and the importance and magnitude of policy reforms necessary to make it sustainable. A sustainable fiscal policy is defined as one where the ratio of debt held by the public to GDP, gross domestic product, the debt to GDP ratio is stable or declining over the long term. GDP measures the size of the nation's economy in terms of the total value of all financial goods and services that are produced in a year. Let me repeat that because it's important to know for the rest of our discussion. So GDP measures the size of the nation's economy in terms of the total value of all financial goods and services that are produced within the year. And that is right here, if you want to read it by yourself as I go along. So I'm underlining that for those of you who are just joining us, or just listening. And of course, if you're listening, you can see everything if you log on to YouTube and view everything. Considering financial results relative to GDP is a useful indicator of the economy's capacity to sustain the government's many programs. This report presents data, including debt, as a percent of GDP to help readers assess whether current fiscal policy is sustainable. The debt to GDP ratio was approximately 97% at the end of fiscal year 2022. So let me read that again. The debt to GDP ratio was approximately 97% at the end of fiscal year 2022. So representation of our debt is about 92% of the goods and services produced in a year. Yikes. That's high already. Down from approximately 100% at the end of fiscal year 2021. That's a good sign, right? It's coming down. No, it's not really. This is a bit of a blip down. The long-term fiscal projections in this report are based on the same economic and demographic assumptions that underlie the SOSI. The current fiscal path is unsustainable. It says again that the unsustainable fiscal path is the headline. The statement in the paragraph here is the current fiscal path is unsustainable. To determine if current fiscal policy is sustainable, the projections based on the assumptions discussed in the financial report assume current policy will continue indefinitely. The projections are therefore neither forecasts nor predictions. Nevertheless, the projections demonstrate that policy changes need to be enacted for the actual fiscal outcomes to differ from those projected. Let me just adjust my microphone. Okay, I'm going to move that down a little bit because I'm looking down. I hope that's okay as far as sound. All right, so that's kind of the preamble to our discussion. So I hope that helps you understand this report and where it's coming from. Now, in this report, there was a graph here, and I'm going to show that graph, and there's another one like it. So you saw this last week, but I'm going to share it again. The debt to GDP ratio was approximately 97% at the end of fiscal year 2022. So we just read that. Under current policy and based on this report's assumptions, it is projected to reach 566% by 2097. So is that possible? Well, it's possible that we get there. How we fund it, is nearly impossible. But the projected continuous rise of the debt to GDP ratio indicates that current policy is unsustainable. Well, of course, you can't have 566% of GDP. And you see, here's where we are currently, right? We're right about here in this graph. And let me see, I didn't capture what these are, but here is spending, non-interest spending. Here they are. And here is total spending. And you'll see that and your primary deficit. But what you see here is this gap that's predicted to continually increase. Now, these are just current programs. These aren't, and this is not a political statement. These aren't proposed programs. These aren't the Green New Deal, and it's not Medicare for all, and it's not all the things that have been talked about. Now, I'm not saying whether they're valid or not. But this is talking about current programs that we have to fund today, and the gap that is quickly coming and already here, right, in the funding and what we have coming in. We talked about last week the difference, and I can shoot over there. I'm not going to do that actually, but the difference between revenues, our tax dollars, and expenditures, and it's a significant amount. So let's continue on. The U.S. Treasury Report. Well, hopefully they say something different. Not really. So this is from the U.S. Treasury Report, and here is the snapshot, the budget and economic outlook. It's called from 2022, or excuse me, I did it again, 2023 to 2033. So they write, federal debt held by the public is projected to rise from 98% of GDP in 2023 to 118% in 2033. So the last one, went out to 566% by 2097. And you're all thinking, oh, we're not going to be here by 2067 or 2097. What do we care? But, if you have grandchildren or children, you should care. But here we are at 118% by 2033. Again, unsustainable. An average increase of 2 percentage points a year. Over that period, the growth of interest costs and mandatory spending outpaces the growth of revenues and the economy, driving up debt. Those factors persist beyond 2033, pushing federal debt higher still to 195% of GDP in 2053. So 30 years, we're at 195% of GDP. In 10 years, at 118%. Now, that's if everything stays, the policy stays the same, spending stays the same. In my lifetime, I really haven't seen significant cuts in spending to affect it. And you've all heard us talk about, the experts, including David Walker, who have said, we either have to, and he said this in 2008 and 2009, we either have to cut expenses in half or double taxes or some combination of the two. And as you know, we've done exactly the opposite. So here's just another graph that shows here we are, right, in 2033 right here, and increased spending relative to GDP. So just not a great projection. And again, this is not any conservative workshop. It's nothing that wants to move the needle on any piece of legislation. These are the Congressional Budget Office and the U.S. Treasury sending out these reports, and they produce them every year. This is nothing new, and this is updated but not new information. Now, this group, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, I've got a lot of information here, so let's try to keep with our time. I'm going to read you these. So we're here. Interest payments on the national debt were $475 billion in fiscal year 2022, so up significantly. 10 years ago it was about $266 billion. Now, if it was, let's just use that number. And we talk about this in our class, $266 billion. I'm writing on the board now, compared to $475 billion. The national debt has increased 6 times, times 6 times. It's increased 6 times. But the payments on the national debt the interest on the national debt has not even doubled, right? And why is that? Well, it's because we've been in a low interest rate environment for the longest period of time, but that's over now. That ship has sailed. The train has left the station. Horses are left the barn. Whatever analogy you want to use, those interest rates are gone, at least for the short term, but probably for the longer term. Those low interest rates. So as interest rates rise, what do? Well, we've got to pay more interest on the debt that we owe to ourselves, our individuals, all this debt on bonds. That's why we're seeing these huge increases in debt, right? Or in debt payment. That's why we haven't seen huge increases in debt payment over that period of time, even though the debt has increased. So 10 years or 20 years ago, that debt was just over $5 trillion, and the payments were $266 billion. So again, a 6 times increase, $5 trillion to $6 31.6 trillion, but the debt payment hasn't even doubled. So look out, because interest rates continue to rise. And as our debt continues to rise, these interest payments have to continue to rise, right? Well, what are they? Last year, they were $352 billion. I'm sorry, 2021, they were $352 billion. In 2022, $475 billion. What are they projected to be in 2023? $640 billion in 2023 is what it's projected to be. And it's projected to grow 35% every year. All right. Highest, I'm going to read this to you. Relative to the size of the economy, interest costs in 2030 will reach 33% of gross domestic product, exceeding the previous post-World War II high of 3.2% of GDP, which was recorded in 1991. These are interest payments, not percentage of national debt. These are two different numbers. These are interest payments associated compared to GDP. Within 10 years, net interest costs will exceed federal spending on crucial programs like Medicaid and defense. Within 10 years, I'm going to repeat that. Net interest costs will exceed federal spending on crucial programs like Medicaid and defense. Spending for net interest will become the largest program in the federal budget within the next 30 years, outpacing spending on Medicare and Social Security. So within 10 years, we spend more on debt payments than Medicaid and defense. And within 30, we spend more on interest payments than anything else, including Medicare and Social Security. So now I'm going to share some charts and graphs from the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. Again, you can find this. It's not hidden information. You can Google it and find it. So net interest costs are projected to exceed the previous high relative to the size of the economy by 2030. So you can see here's where we are, 2023, and it continues to increase dramatically. Net interest as a percentage of GDP. Let's go on. Here's another one. Projections of net interest costs have grown worse over the past year. Net interest, billions of dollars. So you can see here, 2023, we're right here. And these are the actual, and these are the CBO projections for February from 2023 compared to May 2022. So this is last year's projections, 2022. This is this year's projections. Holy cow, big difference. That's what they're trying to tell you. 10-year interest cost between 2024 to 2033, $10.5 trillion. Just last year, they were projecting $8.1 trillion. This next one, Congressional Budget Office projects that long-term interest rates will remain high while inflation and short-term rates will moderate over the next few years. So we're looking at the difference between the interest rates. So now I like this one here. Spending on interest will exceed spending on a number of categories over the next decade. So I don't like it, but it shows well. Fiscal year 2023, billions of dollars. You see here, it shows interest. Here's our standard line here. Interest, other mandatory income, security, Medicaid, CHIP, and premium tax credits, defense, Medicare, non-defense discretionary, and Social Security. Now look at the difference here. Fiscal year 33. Look at the increase. Social Security increases dramatically, Medicare increases dramatically, and interest comes out over top of that. So that's in 10 years. And remember, in 30 years, this line is going to exceed everybody. Very important. And by say, if you're just listening, I'm just drawing here. When I said this line, I mean the interest graphically. This one's staggering. Within 10 years, the federal government will spend more on interest costs than it historically spent on R&D, infrastructure, and education combined. Within 10 years combined, federal government will spend more on interest costs than it historically spent on research and development, infrastructure, and education combined. That's staggering. Spending for net interest is projected to outpace other spending. So this is just showing the sharp increase in net interest. This dark blue line, which at this point, it's about 2043 outpaces Medicare, and about between 2048, shortly after 2048, I'm going to say, halfway, let's call it halfway between 2048, 2053, it outpaces Social Security. Net interest costs will account for almost 40% of federal revenues by 2053. So I think we have all the ammunition we need to talk about the fact that something has to be done about this interest problem we have, federal debt problem and payment of the interest. But the problem is that what's the government going to do? David and I talked about last week in our webinar that, and I talked about the courage. Somebody has to have courage in Washington to make changes to Social Security and Medicare. So just by saying that today, I could never run for Congress because somebody would pull this out and say, Mark wants to make changes to Social Security and Medicare. But let's be honest, folks, we have to make a change. And I'm not suggesting that anybody collecting Social Security and Medicare today has a change, but certainly future generations that haven't yet started relying on this income or benefits, we realize, and we should realize as a nation, have the courage to give our lawmakers courage to change this. But if that doesn't happen, we're looking at a couple of things. Many of you have seen this before. We referred to this as the intersecting line charts. So we spent a lot of time talking about the cost of interest. Cost of interest and national debt. So we know if this line represents revenue and this line represents expenses, we often refer to just Social Security and Medicare here. And now you add on our national debt. We know that Medicare now is scheduled to run out of money. That means the trust fund. So we're talking about trust funds. And these trust funds were established to help pay for the benefits, and at some point they run out, and there's only a percentage of the benefits that are payable. And the trust fund for Medicare runs out in 2035 as of the last report. Now, as of the last report, I'm sorry. That's not right. Wrong number. I was graphically, that didn't look right for me. 2028. Yeah, 2035 is too far away. 2028, right around the corner, within 5 years, that Medicare runs out of money. Now, we talked about the increase in national debt payments, interest payments within 10 years. And that continues to increase. And now we've got to look at, here we are, we're going to just call this, the point in no return, really, 2035, Social Security Trust also goes to zero. So 2028, $0 for Medicare and $0 for Social Security. So it doesn't mean Social Security is completely bankrupt. It means that I think the number is 72%, maybe as high as 77% if you include the disability insurance. But only 72 to 77% of those benefits are payable. So who's going to take that deal? Probably not many people. So we have to do something, and we're going to have to do something, and we think it is right around 2030. So I think government's going to come to us in crisis mode because I don't think we're going to give them the ability to act before that. They're going to come to us in crisis mode and say we need to do something. So we go through these options. Of course, they can cut expenses before that. So if we were in a live class, I'd say, raise your hand if you think the government's going to cut expenses to do this. And maybe one person would raise their hand for it, but it's not likely that they're going to do that. Number two, well, we could print our way out of this, right? There is a theory going around out there, modern monetary theory, that basically says we can spend all the money we want in our federal government because the government can just print money to cover what they need. So I don't agree with that. And I think it's been shown coming out of the COVID, it's been kind of a good test case for that, because we pushed out about $9 trillion altogether with our new debt and our quantitative easing and just funds to go out to individuals and businesses. And that's done a couple of things, but it certainly has driven up inflation for sure. So that's not a viable option. Well, we could borrow money, right? We could borrow money to fill those coffers. Well, that's part of the whole problem. Now we're adding on to the national debt, and we're adding on to those interest payments. So that's not a real answer to it. And it just leaves number 4, which is raise taxes. So we typically, with this intersecting lines discussion, we talk about Social Security and Medicare, but we have to add in interest on the national debt, because all these numbers that I went over with you, where, we're in 30 years, debt's going to be more than any other government program. Within 10 years, it's going to be larger than Medicaid and defense. So I'm hoping it's peaking up your ears, saying, we've got to do something about this individually if Washington doesn't do anything. And individually, you still have the opportunity to position yourself into things that are not going to be taxed in the future. We still have this window of opportunity between now, let's call this 2023. So we have this opportunity between now and 2030. We have this window to be able to start moving things into tax-free entities, Roth IRAs, cash value life insurance, properly structured cash value life insurance, Roth 401ks, et cetera. So any year that we give up that opportunity to do that, we expose ourselves to increased risk to just land here in this horrendous tax situation. And as we've said, on my estimates and the group I work with estimates, is that your average middle-class American is going to be in the 40 to 45% effective tax rate somewhere around 2030. So you got to take an opportunity to shift things from your tax deferred, your taxable bucket, to your tax-free or tax advantage bucket while you still have some time, because every year that passes and this window closes, you have less and less time to do that, and it gets more dire, and it's going to be more costly as we move forward. Okay, so we've covered quite a bit today. It is just 11 o'clock or 10:57. We gave our slide updates. We did a market, some analyst reports, and a little bit of a market review. We went over these huge issues with the national debt. Really discussed a lot. Let me go back to my I gotta find my cursor. I'm so sorry. Oh, goodness, there she is. There I am. Okay, so we talked a lot about these national debt issues, and I hope I've given you enough information that really piqued your interest and said, okay, this is something additional that I really have to pay attention to. Maybe you weren't before. Maybe you're already tuned in and paying attention to that. I'd love to hear from you. Tell me what you thought about this webinar today, or all the webinars. Stay tuned to other webinars coming up. I hope you're getting the notifications. I see those of you joining us today. Spread the word. Share it with your friends if you enjoy this. Hit the subscribe, notify, and like button on these videos, and I hope it's helpful. Even for those of you who are already in this process of shifting your money from forever taxed to, as my mentor Ed Slott says, never taxed, as I like to say, never taxed again. But if you're already in that process, I hope this kind of just shores up your resolve to get that done and continue working with it. If you're not in that process, give us a call. Let's talk about how we can do it for you, set up that strategy. And if I can't help you, we'll find somebody else who can help you. But you got to do something, folks. This train is coming, so you got to act on it. All right. That's all for today. We'll see you next week. Have a great week. Take care.